I'm delighted now to introduce our next plenary, Christian Ethics and Funding, celebrating our ethical traditions to reimagine priority settings in healthcare. Emeritus Professor Stephen Duckett is a health economist and the Honorary Enterprise Professor in the School of Population and Global Health in the Department of General Practice and Primary Care at the University of Melbourne. He's a Fellow of the Academy of the Social Sciences in Australia and one of the Academy of Health and Medical Sciences. He's also held senior positions in Canada and in both the federal and state public services here, including Secretary of the Commonwealth Department of Health. Stephen Duckett also headed up the Grattan Institute's health program for more than a year. But wait, there's more. He has an MA in theology from Chicago Theological Seminary, a certificate in biblical spirituality from the Catholic Theological Union, and a PhD in theology awarded by none other than the Archbishop of Canterbury. A revised version of his PhD thesis, Healthcare Funding and Christian Ethics, was published by Cambridge University Press last year. He was made an Order of Australia in 2023 for significant service to public health policy and management, to tertiary education. Please welcome Stephen. Thank you.
Thank you very much. What I'm talking about today is how we decide what we should be doing. Some of these issues about what should be our decision-making criteria in healthcare. And I'm going to start with a frame that when we're thinking about decision-making, when we're thinking about criteria, we've got to think where those criteria come from. Those of you interested in bioethics will know about the Beecham and Childress famous four, the beneficence, non-maleficence, autonomy, justice, those sorts of things. But they just come out of the blue. Where on earth did they come from? Another way of thinking about it is, in an organisation like this, where might we look for our ethical foundations? And of course, one of the places we might look to is actually the teaching of Jesus. And there's a story that's well known, probably one of the best known stories in the Bible, the story of the Good Samaritan, also known as the story of the Foolish Samaritan. This story, which Jesus tells and is recounted by the author of Luke. And interestingly, the way it's phrased is, what must I do to inherit eternal life? And really what we should be thinking about, what must we be, which is not how the story is actually written. And he starts off, what should I do? And then Jesus says to him, you tell me the answer, whereas in other parts of the Bible it's the other way around. But you tell me the answer, and he says, blah, 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 you must love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your mind, with all your soul, and love your neighbour as yourself. Anyway, so then we come to the next part, who is your neighbour? And this is when we have the story. And the story basically says about the person going down the road, stripped naked, so you've got no idea who they are. Then along comes a couple of people, they do nothing. Along comes a Samaritan, and of course we know that Samaritans were despised at that time by Jews, and so the Samaritan is the most unlikely person to show any support. And in this story we have the Samaritan is the one who sees the person lying on the road and moved by compassion. Now, I've got there the Greek word for compassion. I have no idea how to pronounce it. I have no idea. When I did my thesis, my supervisor, I had a bit there about in Greek, and my supervisor said, "You don't know Greek, do you?" And I said, "No." And he said, "It shows." And then he went and corrected it all. But anyway, this Greek word means viscerally moved, absolutely committed. So what I'm saying is, when I said about Beecham and Childress, where did they come from? I think we can use the Samaritan story to identify certain principles that ought to inform us when we're thinking about the ethics of healthcare funding. And the first of those principles is we ought to be thinking about compassion. We ought to be moved by compassion, and we ought to actually talk about compassion as one of our motivators. The Samaritan was moved, a motivator of compassion. Then the story goes on, and the Samaritan put the guy on the donkey, took them to the inn. Now, innkeepers in those days did not have a particularly good reputation, and the Samaritan said to the innkeeper, "Look, I'll give you some money, look after them. Look after these people, and I'll come back." Now, there's a couple of things here in this part of the story. The first is it's about trust, and Jill talked about trust as well. And here we have the Samaritan saying, "I trust you, even though you may not be trustworthy, to actually spend this money wisely and appropriately." So this leads to the second principle that we might use as a decision-making principle, or as a part of the ethics of healthcare funding, is stewardship. We, as health providers, we, as people involved in governance, we need to be thinking about spending the money wisely. We cannot afford to have a system where we spend money on everything. There is, as an economist, diminishing marginal returns. We cannot afford it. And it is part of our obligation to talk about spending money wisely, to talk about sensible resource allocation, to talk about stewardship. And then, so this is the second principle that comes out. And then we come to the end, and we have the denouement. What on earth is the answer to this? Who was the one that showed mercy? And the lawyer said, who was the one who was the neighbour? And the lawyer says, the one who showed mercy. In different translations, you have go and constantly do the same, and so on. So this is the third principle. The person who was the neighbour, or who was a neighbour, being a neighbour, exhibited neighbourliness, was the most unlikely. And this is the story. This is the third principle, which is about being accessible, being neighbourly to everyone. If you remember at the start of the story, the lawyer wanted to set limits. What is it that I have to do? And in the sense, just tell me this little narrow box, which is all I need to do. At the end, Jesus says you have to do much more than that. You have to do everything more. You have to be generous, which is why the story is sometimes called the story of the foolish Samaritan. So it is about social justice. It is about inclusion. So you end up with three principles that I would argue ought to be decision-making principles when we're making decisions about healthcare funding. The principles of compassion in terms of what our motivator is, the principles of social justice as how we might distribute benefits, and a principle of stewardship. The context in which we do this is we have to be managing scarce resources. So then we might go on a bit further and think about what on earth this means. And this is Martin Luther King in one of his famous speeches, and he said, "We are all called to play the Good Samaritan on life's roadside. But that is only an initial act. One day we must come to see that the whole Jericho Road," which is where the story was set, "must be transformed so that the men and women will not be constantly beaten and robbed as they make their journey on life's highway. It comes to see that an edifice which produces beggars needs restructuring." So this is pointing to a preventive role in all of this. That is, we need to shift the edifices that create the conditions. When we think about, Blair mentioned about prevention and commercial and social and economic determinants. What are the conditions that create ill health, and what are we doing about those? And if you're interested in this, there's a very good little book about thinking beyond the patch-up and thinking towards the prevention in what we might want to do. Then we might actually think a bit further about what we're talking about here. And importantly, in all of these stories, the poor are people. That is, we need to be thinking, and coming back to the compassion point, we need to be thinking about the poor. We need to be thinking about the preferential option for the poor. We need to be thinking, what are we doing and how are we doing it? All of those things simultaneously. And related to this, what we say here, or what this person said is, indeed, it is more common in Scripture for the wealthy to be seen as in a problematic situation than the poor. A brief aside on stewardship and about the innkeeper. The Bible talks about stewardship in a couple of different ways, and I've hinted at them both today. The first is being prudent in our use of resources, and obviously I think that leads to technology assessment, it leads to the use of cost-effectiveness analysis, it leads to being emphasising parsimony rather than greed and overconsumption, and also being concerned about social justice at the same time. I want to talk more about compassion and the Samaritan story. Compassion is something accomplished at all levels of the healthcare organisation. It is not something that only occurs at the bedside. It is something that the board needs to think about. It's something that the Department of Health needs to think about it. Why do I say that? Because one of the things we have to worry about is that a sole focus on efficiency might squeeze out the ability to provide compassionate care. And compassionate care is part of what happens on every day and every life. And what are the elements of that? Compassionate leadership obviously has a number of components. It has some of those things are pretty obvious, but it involves shared leadership and pursuing long-term objectives of the kind that Blair talked about. And so we can think about what on earth does compassionate leadership mean. So talking about boards and leaders, we can think about how do we demonstrate, or what do we privilege in our consideration at the board? So, for example, every board often has every meeting a finance report. Pretty obvious. But what other reports do you have that tells you about the health of the organisation? Obviously, when you're looking at metrics in the healthcare system, there are a number of different perspectives on how you might think about things, one of which is the patient's perspective of what they get out of the organisation and are they treated with dignity and so on and so forth. You also have a different perspective, which is just as valuable, is the clinician-assessed value, that is clinical quality, for example. And finally, you have efficiency as another perspective. All of these are important. No one of them is more important. If you say that the financial report is to some extent about efficiency, to what extent do you hear, for example, of clinician-assessed value? You hear about that often if your board receives a report on clinical quality. And to what extent do you hear about patient-assessed value? It's a different thing from clinician-assessed value. And to what extent do you hear patient stories in your board decision-making? So what are your metrics privileging? And this author suggests there are two lexicons in use in public policy: the language of metrics, but also, and value of growth and resource allocation, but also the language of kindness and grief, of loneliness, of love and friendship, of the ties that bind, and our sense of identity. And what she goes on to say is, if you only focus on one of those, you're stuffed. She says it more gently than that, but that's essentially what she's saying. So what do your metrics privilege? Do they emphasise the finance? Do they emphasise the efficiency, the stewardship? And I have to skip through these. One of the things, and to what extent do they also take into account those other things that I've just talked about, including the ties that bind? And the late Desmond Tutu referred to that a person is a person depends on others to be a person. And obviously, in these contexts, we've always got to be worrying about self-compassion. So, here is a quote from a papal encyclical from the Holy Father, where he says something along the lines of, all of us have in ourselves something of the wounded man, something of the robber, something of the passers-by, and something of the Good Samaritan. That is, if we hear this story, we might say, oh, I'm the Good Samaritan, look at all the good work I do. But no, where are we really? And that was phrased individually. What if we phrase it organisationally? If we extend our gaze to the history of our organisations' lives, all of us, all have something of these. So I'm just going to now ask you to think about, on a scale of 1 to 10, in the last month or so, in your organisation, what have you been more like the robber? So have you been fair in the prices you've charged or the way you've dealt with efficiency sort of issues? To what extent have you been more like the wounded man, a victim of the environment? To what extent have you been more like the passers-by and just ignored all of this? To what extent have you been more like the Samaritan, and to what extent have you been more like the innkeeper? So this is, in a sense, a self-assessment. It's coming back to the reimagined theme. To what extent are you using your resources like the Samaritan did? To what extent are you accumulating resources like the robbers were? To what extent how are your investments priority setting? So what I want to go back to this one. When I reflect on myself in my public commentaries over the decades, I've talked more about social justice and stewardship and less about compassion, even though it's clearly a critical motivator. So what in your environment, in your board meetings, are you thinking more about, are you evenly balanced, as I've argued you should be, or are you unevenly balanced? So the subtitle I was given was, how do we decide what should be our decision-making criteria in healthcare? And I've argued in this talk that they should come from these three principles we can distill from the story of the Good Samaritan. And I've talked a lot more about that in my book, and I'd really love to talk to anybody about any of these issues. Thank you very much.